500 CE, Europa lay shattered. The once peaceful and prosperous provinces of the Western Roman Empire, held together by good roads and competent administration, were now fractured and fragmented. In the place of proconsuls and governors were tribal chiefs and warlords vying with each other for control and preeminence. Even the Christian Church, supposedly aloof from the political winds of fortune, found itself buffeted by divergent theologies of Christ, to the point where those confessing the official creed of the universal body became the minority among Arians, Nestorians, and pagans. While there was also disruption in the eastern half of the empire, due to many of the same issues of outside migration and internal political strife, the emperors of Constantinople better managed the turmoil and would continue the traditions and practices of the Christianized empire for another millennium, though not without various contractions and expansions over time. In the 6th century, in the Western Roman Empire, as trade and manufacturing collapsed and as armed groups roamed the countryside, either as brigands looking to loot and steal, or as armies seeking to impose the will of some distant overlord or emperor, people crowded into walled fortresses and the remnants of once great formerly Roman provincial centers. And when the first wave of the Plague of Justinian hit, they were defenseless. Some historians suggest that this calamity killed as much as 40% of the population, accelerating a decline already precipitous, especially in the cities on the Mediterranean. In this time, there was little theology, less philosophy, and no science. Life was a scramble to stay alive and on the right side of whoever happened to be running things in your part of the world that year. As towns were pillaged and storehouses of knowledge were burned, the very fabric of civilization seemed to be unraveling. No longer did men discuss the dialogues of Plato or the orations of Cicero in the markets of well-ordered towns and cities. In fact, for the most part, no one could even have read them. In churches and cathedrals, even the proclamation of the Holy Scriptures began to return to a place where priests recited them from memory rather than read them from the few remaining copies of the Bible that survived the looting. And so were the great works of Greco-Roman civilization lost to the West. Gone were Aristotle and Ptolemy. Euclid and Galen became almost mythical figures, alongside such strange names as Pythagoras and Archimedes. Soon, even the great physical works that crossed the countrysides of Gaul and Hispania, the aqueducts, were now thought to have been built by a race of giants that once walked the earth rather than by men. Such was the loss of engineering ability, as the legions of once mighty Rome vanished and the eternal city itself was ravaged and depopulated. But even in this, men and women were still curious and clever. Still, they held on to their crafts and trades. Though writing was nearly lost, the regions of Western Europe did not slip back into a Stone Age. The ancient trade routes and more recent Roman roads remained, and goods could still flow along them when the brief periods of peace settled over a place. Men and women still needed clothes, horses still had to be shod, and grain still had to be turned into flour. In this way, the looms, forges, and mills retained some of the technology that had been created. A few cities held on to their Roman character for a century or more, and were never destroyed or abandoned completely. In remote places, far from the rapacious appetites of tribal kings and their hungry armies, men and women gathered to read and write and pray the scriptures of the faith handed to them by their mothers and fathers. They devoted themselves to the practice of producing beautiful copies of their holiest words and worked at being able to understand them. In this way, Latin was saved and our artistic tradition was continued. As the tidal waves of migration and warfare began to settle some, figures capable of exerting a semblance of control and administration began to assert themselves. Though warfare and conquest would remain a nearly constant tool of diplomacy throughout the early Middle Ages in Europe, indeed, throughout most of the history of Europe going forward, there would arise enough political stability that, in time, civilization could once again begin to knit itself into broader tapestries and networks. Over an agonizingly slow course, during the next 9 centuries, a new culture would arise from the ashes of the older Greco-Roman one, carrying with it the vestiges of a legacy in the liberal arts. As the powers of Europe reestablished contact with the wider world, the knowledge lost would begin to make its way back into churches and institutions of learning. At first, this flow of knowledge was a trickle, but over time, that trickle became a stream, and then a river, and finally, with the fall of the last Roman city to the forces of Islam, a gushing torrent that ignited a period of exploration and discovery that continues unabated today. In this broad collapse and recovery, the fortunes of the sciences also followed. While the Hakim of the Islamic Caliphates first translated and then expanded on the works of classical natural philosophy, such considerations, apart from those related to physical tasks of surviving each day, were by and large lost to a part of the world overrun by Germanic peoples. However, as the tribe of the Franks established a political empire across Western and Central Europe, institutions of study were established in the old Roman provincial capitals and trading centers, and the scholars in these places began to work to reestablish learning. It is from these centers that astronomy would once again move out of the realm of being an agricultural necessity to once again ponder questions about the structure of creation. In this episode, we'll examine the journey Europe will take to reacquire what was lost in the time between the plagues. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 10, Astronomy Between the Plagues. As we start out, let me make a couple of prefatory remarks. This week, we'll be stepping back a bit in time and traveling a little bit to the west. While we've just spent 2 weeks looking at advances in astronomy and what could now be thought of as the Middle East, that's not where our journey is eventually going to lead us. The invasions and conquests of the Mongols in the 13th century will destroy the caliphates of Central Asia and Persia and mostly obliterate the centers of learning in the great cities there. As such, while the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age will push astronomical knowledge forward by questioning and improving on the work of Ptolemy, they will not have the chance to move far beyond his assumptions and solutions before their civilization suffers from a fate worse than that of Western Europe. What we need to do is survey a map of the place where we'll eventually make port, Renaissance Europe. Unfortunately, as I hope the intro to this episode made clear, the territories of the Western Roman Empire and Germania have not done very well, at least in the 2 centuries immediately following the sack of Rome in 407. Beginning in the 3rd century CE, and continuing with notable interruptions for the next 200 years, most of what is traditionally thought of as Europe suffered from a series of increasingly calamitous crises. These would eventually lead to political fragmentation and instability that, in turn, resulted in administrative collapse and the breakdown in what could be thought of as a broadly ordered society. With this loss of order, trade became precarious at best, especially overland, and so, in many places, manufacturing ground to a halt. Great centers for the production of goods throughout the former empire were starved of raw materials, and the local economies suffered accordingly, leading, of course, to more social and political instability. While the political ins and outs of this period, i.e., the who conquered who and when kinds of things, are far outside the scope of this podcast for the most part, there will be a couple of events we will take note of as we go along. The first of those is the attempt by the Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian, to reconquer the old western half of the empire in the mid-6th century. The reason that this is important is not that he will eventually fail, but that his soldiers will contract and spread what is now called the Plague of Justinian. While not as well known as the plague with which we will close this episode, known as the Great Mortality or Black Death, the Justinian plague began in around 540 CE and was likely just as deadly due to being caused by the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Beyond being a significant contributing cause to the failure of Justinian's armies to hold what they had conquered in the Western Empire, something that would lead to continuing waves of violence and disruption, it devastated the port cities of the entire Mediterranean and over time worked its way both inland and up the Atlantic coast of Britannia. Probably as close to the biblical horsemen of the apocalypse as Europe ever saw, the associated catastrophes of continuing warfare, plague, pestilence, and famine both snuffed out the last chance of political unification in Europe for centuries and pushed a sort of final collapse of widespread civilization. In many places throughout what had been northern Italia, Gaul, and Hispania, things returned to a state they had been some 500 years earlier. For us, long schooled in the reality of continuous progress, the idea that humanity's condition could be set back by 5 centuries is a bit of a struggle. Even in our most frightening dystopias, we have a hard time capturing what it must have been like. I think for us, it would be a little bit like returning to the late 17 or early 1800s, with no electricity and only inefficient steam engines to do some small bit of work. Yet, with all of that, I don't want to overstate the doom and gloom. The present historical consensus is that the older term once used to describe this period, i.e., the Dark Ages, is likely a vast overstatement. A better metaphor would be that the lights flickered out over time in many parts of Europe, but in some places, those lights would remain on up through the 7th century, or flicker off, get repaired, be used for a while longer, and then the fuel would run out for a while. And it should be noted that the lights stayed on in other places, including the Byzantine Empire and then the Islamic caliphates around the southern Mediterranean into Spain. Still, though, by the 7th century, most of Western Europe outside of Spain has forgotten how to read and write. Latin is only spoken among a few and written among even fewer, and Greek has been lost entirely. This last point is particularly important. While Latin was the language of administration throughout much of the Roman Empire, especially in the West, scholarly work was done exclusively in Greek. Everything from Aristotle to Ptolemy was written in the language of Attica, and so when the empire in the West disconnected from the empire in the East, fewer and fewer people could read and write Greek. And while Latin translations had been made during the period of the late Republic and early Empire by Philhellenes such as Cicero and Hadrian, the stagnation of Roman education in the 2nd century AD and in the 3rd century crisis mostly put an end to that. When the capital moved from Rome to Constantinople, the need for Greek in the western half of the empire basically ceased. As the lights started to flicker, there were those who recognized that if something wasn't done, these works might be lost, and so a movement began to translate as many Greek works as possible into Latin for preservation and continued study. One translator from the 4th century was a man by the name of Chalcidius. For our narrative, his important work is a translation of a portion of Plato's Timaeus, including the parts on spherical cosmology. Additionally, he supplied a commentary that contained a bit of epicycle theory to accompany the work. This was supplemented by Ambrosius Theodosius Macrobius's 5th century commentary on Cicero's Dream of Scipio. The writing contained within it a description of the cosmos centered on a spherical Earth and had the stars rotating on a sphere which also dragged the planetary spheres. These works would give the early medieval thinkers of Europe a very basic picture of classical astronomical models, but one that wasn't nearly as advanced as what was known in the eastern part of the empire and eventually through the Islamic parts of the Mediterranean. Additionally, it served to further advance already ascendant Platonic ideas in medieval thought. At this point, it serves us to mention a particular work by Martianus Capella titled The Nuptials of Philology and Mercury. This title is an allegorical reference to the utility of joining together in one's life intelligent or profitable pursuit as represented by the god Mercury and a love of learning seen in the woman-made goddess Philologia. As part of this work, Capella lays out an educational curriculum founded on the tenets of Neoplatonism that will become the foundation of European medieval education for the next 8 centuries. The work serves as a slender bridge from the late classical period to the medieval mind. As W.H. Stahl writes, quote, "Half classical, half medieval, his work may be likened to the neck of an hourglass through which the classical liberal arts trickled into the medieval world." End quote. His curriculum is based on a 7-subject sort of compendium divided into 2 levels. The first level, known as the trivium, as it was made up of 3 subjects, contained grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The introductory or elementary nature of these subjects leads to our word from that, trivial. The second and more advanced set of subjects was known as the quadrivium and consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. In Book 8 of his work, Capella discusses astronomy, putting forward a geocentric model based on the now standard circular constructions. Interestingly, his model has what seems to have been a novel solution to the problem of maximum elongation. As you may recall from an earlier episode of the podcast, maximum elongation is the observation that 2 of the planets, Mercury and Venus, can only be found within a certain angular distance of the Sun. While Ptolemaic models often suggested that this was because the epicycles of those 2 worlds had to be connected to a crystalline bar that ran from the luminary sphere to the solar sphere and moved as if it was attached to the Sun, Capella's model moved the 2 planets so that they, instead of orbiting the Earth, they orbited the Sun. This model shared some of the characteristics with the one put forward by al-Balkhi a few centuries later. It's unknown whether Capella is the originator of this idea or if he is merely writing down the idea of another thinker whose work we have long since lost. A final translator and commentator to mention from this period is Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, a politician and philosopher who was also part of the court of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great in the early 6th century. While he translated several works by both Aristotle and Cicero, these translations mainly related to logic and rhetoric. This focus ensured that a great deal of thinking in the early universities of Europe would focus on the logical consistency of various arguments. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the sputtering torch was carried forward by the only body at the time with the resources to do so, the Catholic Church. While battered and bruised by 2 centuries of warfare, the Church had managed to form an alliance with a rising tribe of Germanic peoples known as the Franks. During the 6th century, the Frankish ruler Clovis I had managed to defeat various Gothic, Saxon, and Alemanni armies and so establish a place wherein those Christians who professed the Nicene Creed could find a place from which to combat the dominance of those who held Arian or Nestorian confessions, when they confessed anything at all. As the one body that had managed to weather the various storms while keeping intact some small body of knowledge, the Church was best positioned to begin moving forward once things settled down a bit. The 2 figures most associated with this are Isidore of Seville and the Venerable Bede, both bishops of the Church. The impetus for their respective works, however, were somewhat different. For Isidore, the goal was to produce a compendium of knowledge that integrated the Christian faith in such a way that it could be used as a reliable guide in the education of priests and ecclesial leaders. To this end, he wrote a 20-volume encyclopedia of sorts known as the Etymologies or Origins. This work exerted passages from a variety of other authors, mostly from the late classical period, and tied them together with commentary meant to highlight their congruence with Scripture. As one commentator has put it, the words of Isidore act as mortar by which the stones of the classical authors were held together. Nevertheless, the work was an impressive one, especially for the time, and it served its purpose well and would, in time, become the book most often found in libraries around Europe for centuries afterwards. The downside of this work, not that this was Isidore's fault, was that so popular was the Etymologies that it displaced works from which it drew its materials, often causing those works to be forgotten or lost. The Venerable Bede, a British monk from Jarrow, was involved in another project, one of greater practical importance for the Church Universal. Like both Jewish and Islamic believers, Christians had certain dates on the calendar that needed to be marked accurately, none more so than Easter. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the date of Easter was set by conciliar decree to be the Sunday of the first full moon after the vernal equinox. And as you've likely noticed, there was a question, a really good question, as to whether anyone in the lands of the former Western Roman Empire might still possess the skills necessary to make the appropriate observations to establish the date of the equinox. Moreover, it was also questionable that once that date had been established, that it could be communicated to each of the dioceses under the Church's authority. In the East, this wasn't such a big issue because of the inherited intellectual tradition of Alexandria that would allow for periodic observations to be made to establish the equinox and then calculate the date on which it would occur for the next decade or so. In the West, however, the lack of observational and calculational ability led to a different idea. Bede recognized that the dating should be cyclical, and so set to figure out how the Metonic cycle synchronized with the Julian calendar dates. After some work, he published a book titled On the Divisions of Time, which laid out a repeating 532-year pattern of Sundays on which Easter would take place. This work also included a discussion of the traditional medieval view of the cosmos, including an explanation of how models accounted for the change in the length of daylight each day, of how the seasonal motion of the sun and moon influenced the changing appearance of the new moon at evening twilight, and a quantitative relation between the changes of the tides at given places and the daily motions of the moon. Bede also included a section on natural philosophy, much in the spirit of a similar section in Isidore's work. The next event we should spend a bit of time discussing is that of the rise of Pippin the Short and his son Charles, beginning in around 750 CE. The previous 150 years had been a period of ups and downs for the Frankish kings of Western Europe. There had been periods where the various factions of Frankish nobility had been united under a single strong leader, such as had been the case with Clotaire II, and times when they were fractured. It was during one such time in the late 7th century, as Isidore and Bede were writing, that the Islamic Moors of Spain were making advances up the Iberian Peninsula towards Gaul. It was Pippin's grandfather, Pippin of Herstal, who had brought the warring factions together in 687, and his son, Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, which has to be like the coolest name in history, who stopped the Moorish advance at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. Under Pippin the Short, and more so under his son Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, the Franks brought together through warfare and diplomacy, with church sanction, much of the territory of the former Western Roman Empire for the first time, including Gaul, Italy, and Germany. As part of this short-lived political unification, Charlemagne was named King of the Romans. One of the embarrassments Charlemagne felt keenly was his own illiteracy And so, as part of his work to renew the area under his authority to some part of its former Roman greatness, he instituted an effort to create centers of learning and scholarship. This effort was a part of and driving force for what is often called by historians the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intellectual and cultural flourishing that lasted some 100 years. He was aided in this effort by the Bishop of York, a guy by the name of Alcuin, who created the first establishments of learning around Europe by enlarging already existing monasteries and churches and by standardizing the curriculum around the trivium and quadrivium we discussed earlier. These institutions serve as the centers of a much greater movement we'll look to after the break. As we discussed in the episode on Islamic astronomy, as Charlemagne was building his empire in much of Europe, the Umayyad rulers were moving their caliphate in Spain to new cultural heights. As part of this, there were centers of learning established at Toledo and Cordoba, among other places. Over time, information began to bleed across the interface between the Christian areas of southern France and northern Spain and the Islamic Caliphate of Cordoba. The first things that were exchanged were physical artifacts, astrolabes and armillary spheres that encoded within their physical structure the cosmological view of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Next were bits and pieces brought back by European scholars who encountered Islamic astronomers tasked with setting up the time and direction of prayer. As time passed, though, the Umayyad dynasty gained and lost power and control, as was usually the case in centralized political systems of the time. The Frankish Empire of Charlemagne has broken apart in the intervening 2 centuries as well. And so, by the 11th century, there's sort of a conflict. The larger caliphate had fractured into many smaller entities known as taifas. While there was some political and military cooperation between these smaller principalities, the Christian kingdoms, especially those in northern Spain, were able to make inroads into reconquering parts of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1085, the city of Toledo was captured, and rather than burning it and its vast scholarly library to the ground, the soldiers allowed both of those to stand. And within a few decades, scholars began to travel to this repository to study the Greek and Islamic texts that had been kept therein. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the works of the great thinkers could be available to those who could learn how to read Arabic and Greek. One such individual was Gerard of Cremona. In 1144, he traveled to Toledo to look at a single text, the Almagest. When he arrived, he realized that the entire thing was in Arabic, and to properly translate the passage he was interested in, he would need to learn the language more completely. Over the next 30 years, he does that, while translating over 85 scientific works into Latin, including the Almagest. Included in these were Aristotle's On the Heavens and Physics, Euclid's Elements of Geometry, and Al-Khwarizmi's Al-Jabir. For our purposes, it would seem like his translation of the Alchemist would be the most important thing. But that wasn't the case. It was actually Al-Farghani's Elements of Astronomy and Ar-Zakali's Tables of Toledo that were initially much more important. While Ptolemy's work had been the basis for these 2 books, the Alchemist was really too complex to be understood initially by European thinkers. Too much knowledge and information had been lost to completely grasp the full picture of what Ptolemy had done. Thus, the primer that had been put together by Al-Farghani way back in the time of Al-Mamun was an essential bridge to understanding the more complex work. Ar-Zakali's tables allowed for the positions of the stars and planets to be predicted when adjusted for different latitudes and longitudes, even before European astronomers figured out how to get the mechanisms Ptolemy had proposed to produce said predictions. We'll return to why this was so important in a few moments. At roughly the same time, the Byzantine Empire gifted to the King of Sicily a Greek copy of the Almagest. While this copy was closer to the original manuscript, as it hadn't gone through translation into Arabic, the translation of it into Latin would never be as popular as that of Gerard due to the lack of introductory material to help the reader understand what was going on. At this point, I think it's helpful for us to make 3 points before going forward. First, Constantinople. One of the things I've been trying to track down for the better part of the last week is where was Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire during the last couple of centuries. I understand that prior to the Carolingian Renaissance, that there may have not been enough going on in the Western Empire, or Western Europe I should say, to interest or engage Byzantine scholars. And after 1066 and the Great Schism, I can see that there would have been a barrier to cooperation, something that of course was made immeasurably worse by the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. What I'm struggling to get my head around is why there wasn't some sort of flow of source text or scholarly exchange going on in the 3 centuries between about 750 and 1050 CE. The only thing I can come up with is that the Byzantines just weren't all that interested in natural philosophy. While they were certainly active in areas of theology, law, and to some lesser extent philosophy, there doesn't seem to have been any real activity in even keeping up with the intellectual heritage left by their Greek forebears. I'm not sure if that's due to the rise of Neoplatonism as the dominant philosophical paradigm, the nearly constant warfare with the Islamic states to the east and the Slavic and Germanic peoples to the north, or just a cultural decline in intellectual curiosity. But one thing that is very telling is that there are no historical mentions of great libraries or institutions of learning in the Byzantine Empire that I've come across in my research. There's no Library of Alexandria or House of Wisdom or Great University that I've been able to come across. There's no rise of great faculties in those universities or groups of scholars to teach students. If one of my listeners has any insights as to what might be going on in this period, I would be very interested to hear your ideas. Leave us a comment on the Facebook page or at our website at thescientificodyssey.typepad.com or drop me a note at cldavies@mac.com. Second, astrology. I'm coming to the conclusion that I'm going to need to do a supplemental episode on astrology here in the fairly near future. The subject is too intertwined with astronomy as a motivating impulse not to devote some real time to it and how it worked. It keeps showing up in various episodes, and so I will pull the various threads together to talk about it more coherently at some point fairly soon. Nevertheless, I should make a mention of it here in order to understand why astronomy is going to become very important again in Europe. In addition to the usual functions of prediction and prognostication, astrology had fulfilled throughout the ages. There was a second impetus to be concerned with it. One of the things Aristotle had believed was that there was sort of a macro-micro connection going on in the world. He thought that the functions of the cosmos on the largest scale were mirrored in and connected to the functions of individual organisms, including human beings. As such, he felt that to understand the way the human body and a person worked, one had to know the state of the larger universe. For Aristotle, this was not some sort of a mystical thing, but rather a physical connection between things in the terrestrial and celestial realms. As Aristotle's writings began to make their way into Europe through the Spanish translation movement we've been talking about, his medical ideas, along with the four humors idea of Galen, take on increasing importance. Thus, for those seeking to study medicine, part of any diagnosis was to understand the state of the human body both at birth and in the present. Therefore, the ability to create horoscopes was considered an important part of medical practice. Third, formal education and scholasticism. By the time the Spanish translation movement really gets going, the education system begun by Charlemagne and Alcuin have really begun taking root. In various places, professional schools have sprung up to add to the study of the liberal arts. In Bologna, there arises a law school, and Padua is one of the first medical colleges. In all of these institutions, Latin is used, and so the scholars are able to overcome the language barriers that have arisen between the various local regions in Europe. However, as the new texts begin to flow into Europe, a whole new scholarly movement begins to come about, something known as scholasticism. While this movement takes hold in many places, the two universities it establishes itself most deeply and profoundly in are the University of Paris and, a bit later, at the University of Oxford in England. The key idea in scholasticism is a rejection, at least in part, of the idea expressed most forcefully by Athanasius back in the 4th century, and that is that God could be known by faith alone. Scholastics felt that the use of reason could shed light on the nature of the divine, and so there was the development of a dialectic process of asking questions and then seeking answers through thesis and antithesis. Before long, this method began to spread into the consideration of other topics, including a study of the natural world and natural philosophy. It is into this movement that the various translational texts will become important. Early in this process, there is one figure who will sort of tower over all of the others, a Spanish Muslim, a scholar by the name of Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as he is known in Latin. Born in 1126, Ibn Rushd is an intellectual giant who takes up the study of Aristotle as the main work of his life. While the works of Aristotle had mostly been lost to the West and neglected in the Byzantine Empire due to a preference for the writings of Plato, there had been a long philosophical tradition of engaging with his philosophical ideas in Islam. A number of philosophers from Al-Kindi onward had wrestled with integrating the writings of Aristotle with the teachings of the Prophet, and so there was a rich intellectual tradition surrounding the study of his works and a fairly vast compendium of thought related to that topic. Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as we'll call him from here going forward, entered this tradition and carried it forward by translating Aristotle's works into Latin, but also by commentating on them extensively and insightfully. So effective was this work that in time, Aristotle became known in the High Middle Ages as, quote, the philosopher, and Averroes was known as, quote, the commentator. This, however, will spark a crisis in the scholastic community. The philosophical writings of Aristotle had two problems from the perspective of the Catholic Church. First, they contradicted the picture of Plato, or at least the Neoplatonic interpretation of that picture. Second, the person who seemed to be doing the most insightful communication of Aristotle's ideas was not a Christian, but a Muslim. For a time, the Church would outlaw the teaching of much of Aristotle's writings in its universities, but over a period, various scholastic writers will show that the ideas of Aristotle were not counter to the theological doctrine and dogma of the time. No figure was more important to this than Thomas Aquinas, who would effectively synthesize the two within a century of Averroes' death. His work, the Summa Theologica, would become the de facto teaching of the Church on many issues of doctrine. More importantly for our story, and scientific inquiry in general, Aquinas believed and argued for the idea that the nature of the Creator could be known and understood through knowing and understanding His creation. As such, a study of natural philosophy would be considered a worthwhile pursuit for the scholarly communities that were growing within the Church's various monastic orders, most specifically the Franciscans and the Dominicans. With these points made, let's see if we can return to our narrative to understand what happens within this cultural context with respect to the study of astronomy. If the 12th century is a time of translation, then the 13th is a period of assimilation and understanding. As was the case in 7th and 8th century Baghdad and the translation movement there, it's not enough to just have access to a set of documents and the ability to read and write a language. Even if those two conditions are met, the translator still has to understand the subject being translated well enough to be able to make an accurate rendering of the work. For philosophy, this was hard enough, but for the writings on science, there were other complicating factors. An example of this has to do with numbering systems. If we consider the Almagest, Ptolemy is writing in Greek, which used letters for numbering. He had, however, taken much of his data from the Mesopotamians, who had used cuneiform-based 60 number sets. Islamic translators had taken these and translated them into Hindu Arabic-based 10 numbers that included a 0, the type we use today, but that were completely unknown in Europe at the time, as the lingua franca there was, of course, as I mentioned, Latin, which, like Greek, uses a letter-based number system. So, if you want to translate the Arabic version of the Almagest, you have to know not only Arabic, but you have to learn how to use the Hindu Arabic numbers and math, which likely included algebra. You then had to figure out how to translate that into Latin, which lacks the idea of a 0, the idea of a variable, and isn't really very good at representing more complex mathematical operations. It's not trivial. It's also why some of the primer texts that are being rediscovered are so important. Whether it was the Little Astronomy, that primer of less advanced works on astronomy that had been compiled in the late classical period, or Al-Farghani's introduction, these will begin to serve as bridge texts to teach the translators and new students terminology and methods of calculation. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, there are a flurry of commentaries on the work of Ptolemy. The biggest takeaway from these is the almost uniform denouncement of anything in the Almagest that deviates from the principles of Aristotle's celestial physics. The Earth at the center of the cosmos, and planets moving on circular paths in constant motion. While Averroes acknowledges that the Ptolemaic model, quote-unquote, saves the appearances, in that it produces the motions of the objects seen in the heavens, he, being strongly committed to Aristotelian thinking, expresses doubts that the physical model is correct. This perspective is echoed by the best known and most talented Jewish philosophical thinker of the time, Moses Maimonides. If one looks at the cosmological models from this time, as represented in various texts, they are for the most part clear restatements of simplified versions of Aristotle's spheres, though not the full model that had been put forward by Eudoxus or Callippus that we talked about several episodes ago. In the mid-13th century, works began to be produced that show that the assimilation process was beginning to reach a point where new works could be produced. While the first of these were treatises on material already known, they showed that the subject had been fully digested, understood, and reformulated in a form that was understandable by the medieval European mind. Perhaps the most emblematic of these works is the work done by Johannes de Sacrobosco at the University of Paris. He is known for writing an introduction to the Hindu Arabic number system and some on the basic principles of algebra. The work was known as Algorithmus, and that was a fairly clear and understandable presentation of that material. More importantly, he also wrote Tractatus de Sphera, or On the Sphere of the World, which served as an introduction to Ptolemaic astronomy by combining several of the introductory and explanatory texts of Islamic astronomers. So important was this text, written in 1230, that it would become a fundamental part of the university curriculum in Europe for the next 4 centuries. It should be noted, though, that as important as this work was, it still only served as an introduction. It did not fully explain the model of Ptolemy. It did, however, clearly reintroduce the idea of planetary retrograde motion being explained by epicycles and deference, making it possible for scholars to understand what some of the fuss was about in the writings of Averroes and others. As a final note on his work, John of Holywood, as he is sometimes called, was among the first to recognize that the Julian calendar being used at the time suffered from an accumulating error that by the 13th century amounted to 10 days. it would be another 300 years before this would be addressed with the Gregorian calendar in 1581. In addition to works of an instructional nature, there were also a series of practical star tables produced. The first of these, of course, were a translation of Al-Khwarizmi's tables that had been produced in the 11th century. These would soon be superseded by what are known as the Toledan tables, due to having been produced in Spain. As mentioned in the last episodes, these are actually referenced in Chaucer's Franklin's Tale, showing the author's and audience's familiarity with the growing need for accurate astronomical data as a requirement for astrological practice. In 1230, King Alfonso X of Castile gathered a group of scholars together to produce an even more accurate set of tables. First published in Spanish in around 1270, but containing data that actually went back to 1252, the Alphonsine tables, as they were known, would reach Paris in Latin translation in 1320, and would become the de facto standard for the next 200 years. While it was not known at the time, later research would show that the tables had to be produced with a thorough use of the full Ptolemaic model. Now at the same time, Altusi is producing what was the finest set of observationally based star charts and tables based on data collected at the Moraga Observatory in Central Asia. While this would take time to be transmitted into Europe, it would add to the growing information that was accumulating in the European universities and being taught to students there. As the middle of the 14th century approached, it would seem that medieval Europe was on the cusp of making a leap forward both culturally and scientifically. At Oxford, two scholars, one a bishop and another a Franciscan monk, were making startling inroads in both the study of light, based in part on the writings of Al-Kindi and Al-Haytham, and the development of a method of inquiry related to the natural world. So important was the work of Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon that Pope Clement IV would invite Bacon to write an encyclical on the study of the natural world. However, in 1347, following a decade of weather-related environmental disruptions, a ship full of sick merchants from the Crimea would make port in Venice. The plague that was unleashed in that fateful year would once again bring Europe to its knees. Called many names by later historians, it was simply known at first as the Great Mortality, or Great Dying. Within 50 years, upwards of 50% of Europe's population would be dead. Like the Plague of Justinian, it was caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, and it killed indiscriminately. Beyond its human toll, though, it left a wake of deep cynicism towards the cultural institutions of the High Middle Ages, none of whom had been able to offer solutions to the crisis. Due to this disruption, it would be nearly a century before new work would be done in any of the natural sciences, including astronomy. However, this time, those seeking to move forward would not have to start from scratch. Unlike with the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was no accompanying outbreak of widespread warfare and cultural destruction. As such, the universities and libraries remained relatively intact. The culture, while disrupted, was not destroyed. Just as importantly, with the failures of all parts of the medieval order to deal with the Black Death, there were those who were willing to question everything that had been thought to be absolute and true. As we have reached the time of the Great Plague, this is a good place in the narrative for us to take some time to dock the ship and re-provision our stocks and stores. As such, the next couple of episodes will be of the supplemental variety. First, I'd like to return to China to take a look at what's been going on in astronomy there since we last left. Also, as I mentioned in this episode, it's probably a good time for us to spend a little bit of time talking about how we tell time. The calendar crisis is going to be a factor in our story after Europe recovers from the Great Mortality, so it'll be useful for us to know the issues and how they came about. Also, finals week is upon me, and so I'm not sure how regular the schedule will be for the next couple of weeks. I'll try to drop an episode each Sunday as I have for the last 5 months or so, but if I get swamped by grading, there may be some disruption. I deeply appreciate any patience you can muster, and once we get past this, we'll be back out on our typical schedule. As always, thanks so much for listening. For those who are new to the show, please take a moment to rate us on whatever service you're using. I think this is the first episode that will be released after we've gone live on Google Play Music. If you're listening to us through that platform, welcome aboard, and be sure to go back and pick up on the earlier episodes of the series. It will help you understand some of the things we're talking about. Also, if you haven't already done so, be sure to check out the Facebook page for the podcast and like us there. Become part of the crew of the Odyssey, the lab rats as we call ourselves, and feel free to post questions or items of interest that you feel others might enjoy. Faithful listener Andrew Mentz recently posted a link to a BBC In Our Time episode on James Chadwick and the discovery of the neutron that's really excellent. If you enjoyed our series on the atom from a few months ago, I recommend taking a listen to that. Until next time, full sails on your journey.